Greetings, good evening, and welcome to the show. This is the First Amendment, historically speaking, and I'll be your host today. My name is Frederick Douglass Dixon. And again, I want to thank UPTV for allowing us this opportunity to forward what we consider to be esoteric but mandated information to add to the knowledge and the pot of knowledge again. So we thank you. And I want to begin by being very clear and thanking for a great time and a great weekend. The famous, world famous DuSable Museum, Jean-Baptiste Point DuSable Museum in Chicago, Illinois. Last week they honored my father, the Honorable Professor Willie Dixon Jr., for his over 50 years of work. So I want to thank Mr. Pomone Ramey, his entire staff, and all of those laborers who made that a very enjoyable evening. It seemed to be a reflection of 50 years in one particular afternoon. It was Founders Day. So all of that made way for a very entertaining and very well-deserved honor for him. So I thank him, and I want to tell him hello as well, and continue to do what you do, and I thank you so very much, and I love you dearly. So today I wanted to begin to talk about critical thinking, and I wanted to forward some of the thoughts when we begin to talk about critical thinking, especially in the idea of a serious paradigm that's rarely discussed and outside of academia maybe even looked to as taboo or voodoo. So today will be a very interesting half an hour, and we will also try to get directly to the point and open up some avenues for critical thought. So when we begin to talk about critical thinking, we want to be able to have information that we understand, and for some of us, some information that will indeed in itself add to the body of knowledge, but it will question. It will bring the idea of reflection, self-reflection, self-correction. So in that regard, we want to talk about critical thinking and what it means to our topic today. Now, our topic today is a privilege, and a privilege in regard to American society. So to start this at the beginning, if it's proper, and the beginning is very proper for us, when we begin to talk about privilege, and American privilege, and we'll go into a subcontext of American privilege, but the overall arching theme today is critical thinking and privilege. So I want to use some scholars who are far wiser than I and have left so many things behind for us to digest and for us to interject into curriculum or even just thought. That we'll begin with the idea of Mr. Edward Shields. Mr. Edward Shields was a professor of sociology at the world-famous University of Chicago. And Mr. Shields wrote more than one piece, but two of his more famous pieces, one is called Center and Periphery. That's about the way that we look at society, the center of society and those who fall along the outside. And then he wrote a piece that's called Color. And when we talk about Edward Shields, this was a very brilliant man, and some of his ideas, he's trained generations of historians, generations of sociologists, and generations of intellects. So it'd be very wise to look at this wise man. And he starts off in one of his perhaps most famous works, Color, the Universal Intellectual Community and the Afro-Asian Intellectual. Although that sounds very complex, we'll break that down right now. And he goes on to say, in itself, and I'm quoting, color is meaningless. It is not like religion, which is a belief and entails either voluntary or hereditary membership in a community of believers, and therewith exposure to an assimilation of traditions of belief. He said, color is not like that. He said, color is also not like kinship, which is a tangible structure in which the individual has lived. Color is not like that. It is not like intellectual culture or the way that you look at the world or the way that the world looks or perceives you. Color is not like that. He says, not even like nationality, which is a superimposition of beliefs about a particular community and what they have done. He says the idea, color is just color. It is a physical spectroscopic fact. Color is just color. And he also says that there are no compelling deducible conclusions regarding a person's color. He said, yet the mind is attracted by color. Well, in American society, I would question Mr. Edward Shields right now, here, and say that color in itself in American society perhaps is opposite or diametrically opposed to what he is saying. So he goes on to say, it has no moral significance. There we are again. I question, at best, what Mr. Shields is saying. He said color has no moral significance. Now we need to be able to be critical enough to be self-reflecting about American society and how color has painted the picture of what American society looks like today. So again, I not only question Mr. Shields, Professor Shields, and his work, but I would like to challenge and advance his work so that he could, as he has groomed generations of those who take his words as historical dictums, and the way that their avenues have produced generations and generations of scholars and those who will be teachers and instructors who look to this mindset and say to themselves, color has no meaning. He says it from the very beginning. Color is meaningless. Well, good news for one group is normally bad news for another group. So when he says color is meaningless, he has to be talking about the idea of the position in which he sits as a formally educated professor at the University of Chicago in the 50s. So he begins to say that no intentions are expressed by color. No interpretations of the world are inherent to it. No attachments are constituted by it. The mind is not at work at it, and it is not a social relationship. So again, he says, color in itself is inherently meaningless. I question and challenge Mr. Shields, Professor Shields, and his work. So now when we talk about color in American society, being critical about the thought, then we think of, just for this particular time that we have, the color that dominates, that is white in America. And then we go on to tie this to a compound term, which we're going to go with today, white privilege in America. And we'll tie this back to Mr. Shields' thought. We'll also tie this back to critical thinking. And before we are done, we have already raised the idea of critical thinking during this small time that we have here. And we'll be challenging those who actually believe that what Mr. Shields said is representative of how American society looks at color today. So I want to go to Mr. Webster's 1913's dictionary and say that a privilege is a particular benefit, advantage, or favor, a right of immunity not enjoyed by others or by all, a special enjoyment of good or exemption from an evil or burden, a pejorative advantage, and a franchise. So when we go on, this same dictionary says that to grant some particular right or exemption to invest with a peculiar right or immunity, to authorize as to privilege representation from arrest. So now when we tie these two together, we get the compound term of white privilege. White privilege in America, and I'm ready to go. White privilege in America is indeed the avenue by which this particular country has been founded. It has been multiplied and festered, and we see its earnings today. The illusions of inclusion happen to be the stalwarts, or happen to be those interlocking pieces in our societies that gives other demographics the thought of connections to white privilege. So one person who is another scholar who's much wiser than I about this particular topic, and we'll take a very unique look at this particular thought, is Peggy McIntosh. Now, Peggy McIntosh is indeed a professor, so she is a scholar. She is one of the academy. So we still have not tied into those of us who are not from the academy, or those of us who are not of the learned thought of American society, but we will attempt to do that. So with Miss Peggy McIntosh in 1988, she wrote a piece that I think is valued, and its value comes from her unique point of view and where she sits in American society on a societal totem pole. It's called White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. Now, I want to be very clear about this title, White Privilege and Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. Miss or Mrs. Peggy McIntosh, the professor herself, is a white female. So this is coming from the thought of one person who has looked at society from a specific point of view, and that's all this is, one specific point of view. We will tie it in together, but to look at white privilege from the vantage point of a white professional woman in America leaves a lot to be desired, but it also forwards that esoteric part of information that's rarely seen. And when we talk about the academy, yeah, this may be discussed because of writings like Peggy McIntosh, but outside of the academy and even inside the academy, when we begin to talk about white privilege, those particular thoughts that have permeated, those particular professors who have, with the strength of Hercules, stuck up for the status quo, whether they do it willingly or unwillingly, or whether they do it in a manner that is knowing, or whether they do it in a manner that is unknowing, it's still the same effect. So she goes on and she talks about how she thinks that, she says, I think whites are carefully taught not to recognize white privilege, as males are taught not to recognize male privilege. I know as a male in America, in a chauvinistic society, we are indeed taught not to look at our male privilege, but absorb it and never give it up. So if this is commonplace, or what we say comparable to white privilege, then we understand that it's not discussed. And as we look at it discussed by a white female, this may shed light. Indeed, it may give us another thought. She goes on to say, so I've begun in an untutored way to ask what it is like to have white privilege. Well, I, as a person who is indeed the opposite of a person with white privilege, can understand that there's two sides to this coin, at least. The side of the coin that we understand that is white privilege, and the other side that is not. Now, with Peggy McIntosh's thought being critical about tying these things together, we must realize that she speaks from the vantage point of a feminist, a white feminist who has indeed had a seat of privilege, a catbird seat, to every other group on the planet except for white men. That's the only group that she is bound and doomed to answer to. I have come to see white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets which I can count on cashing in every day, but about which I am meant to remain obvious or choose to remain obvious. White privilege is like an invisible, weightless backpack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks that she can take advantage of on a daily basis. After, this is Peggy McIntosh still, after I realized the extent to which men work from a base of such unearned, acknowledged privilege, I understood that much of their offensiveness or oppressiveness was unconscious. Then I remembered the frequent charges from women of color that white women whom they enter are oppressive. I began to understand why we are justly seen as oppressive, even when we don't see ourselves in that manner. I began to count the ways in which I enjoy unearned skin privilege and have been conditioned into oblivion about its daily existence. She's being very critical about herself. Now, I'm going to be critical about her being critical about herself. She is speaking to a group. She is speaking to an audience. There is a creation of an audience that wants to hear this. So her scholarly work is indeed needed. But I want to go to the group that would tie into this. There's that feminist white group, and then there's everybody else. Those of us who do not have the choice, or do not have the connection, or do not have the privilege of white privilege, then we look and see that there's the remainder of the population who wants to hear these particular thoughts that come from whom? Someone of that particular thought, but no one, not a white man. So this still does not climb to the top of the bell tower, but you're getting very close. She says, my schooling gave me no training to see myself as an oppressor. So in the educational system, it's not taught white privilege. And an unfairly advantaged person or a particular participant in a damaged culture. I was taught to see myself as an individual whose moral state depended on the individual moral will. My schooling followed the pattern my colleagues have pointed out for years, whites are taught to think of themselves as morally neutral, normative, and advantage, also ideal, so that when we work to benefit others, this is seen as work. We allow them to be more like us. And then she comes, and what makes this so very devastating, she comes and she speaks of at least 26 different ways that she can enjoy white privilege on a daily basis, but remain totally unconscious to them through a learned behavior. She says, if I wish to be in the company of people of my race, most of the time I can. She said, if I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing a home in the area which I can afford and which I want to live. Number 3, I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or even pleasant to me. Number 3, she talks about the way that she'll be treated as pleasant. Then there's that 90% of us, if not more, that will be treated unpleasant. So everything that she says has a point counterpunch, a punch counterpunch to it. And her thoughts are indeed brilliant because there is a certain connection to truth. And one of our greatest historians, he said it very brilliantly, Dr. John Hope Franklin, who wrote a book called Mirror to America, which I think that is very much so a needed and very much so mandated reading. And he says the essence of scholarship is truth. She goes on to say, I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. There's a counterpunch to that. I can turn on television or open to the front page of the paper and see my people of my race widely represented in a positive fashion. Punch, counterpunch. I can turn the TV on in the first 5 minutes of the TV, of the news. I can find people who look just like me creating murder and mayhem while we pay attention to their behaviors and never pay attention to whom they learn the behaviors from. She goes on to say, when I'm told about our national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. When I am, as a person or the son of mine or my grandchildren, when they pick up books, they will be shown that their history starts with slavery. And they were a group of folks who were rescued by Christian slave catchers who made them better and made them far more civilized. This is indeed white privilege, and on the back of that, everybody else is disadvantaged. More specifically, black inferiority is created by these thoughts. I can be sure that my children will be given a curriculum materials that testify to the existence of their race. Well, on the bottom side of that, I can be sure that my children will get their hands on a curriculum will paint them as best as second class or binary citizens. If I want to, I can be pretty sure of finding a publisher for this piece on white privilege, and she did. And we are still using it today. I can do well in challenging situations without being called a credit to my race. She continues on. So we as a group, when we think critically about what white privilege is in American society, then I have to go back. And I have to challenge what Mr. Edward Shields says when he says, the professor himself said that color is meaningless. Meaningless to whom? Meaningless to what group? Meaningless in what fashion? And we talk about how society and American society creates identities. I want to go straight to the idea of what Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of our greatest sociologists and historians, called the crisis of identity. And he talked about this. He said, what after all am I? Am I an American or am I a Negro? Can I be both? Or is it my duty to cease to be a Negro as soon as possible and be an American? That's the crisis of identity on the other side of white privilege. This indeed is a crisis. He goes on to say, if I strive as a Negro, am I perpetrating the very cleft that threatens and separates black and white America? Is not my only possible practical aim the subjection of all that is Negro into me that must lead to me to be American? Does my black blood place upon me any more obligation to assert my nationality than German, Irish, or Italian blood would? Those are excellent questions. This question was asked in 1897. So these aren't new questions. And regardless of the scholar, these have been discussed. When we discuss them amongst what we call black academia, if there's such a word, which it is, then we look to how the black scholar has played a role as the linchpin to continue white superiority. How? Because in the academy, when you begin to research not just the people and you research the problem, and when you go a step further and research not just the problem or just the people with the problem, but those who have created the problem, then those particular research projects won't be funded. We're about to have about a clear change on how some of these things are funded. So W.E.B. Du Bois paints the picture very well. And then we go to Mr. Robert E. Parks, another sociologist, professor at the University of Chicago, that when we talk about white privilege, we talk about the area of housing, and then what we know now is the ghetto. That is a group now that we know to be housed by people of less fortunate means. So when we understand that they say in the ghetto, and this is Mr. Robert Parks being a sociologist at the University of Chicago in 1952, he says the ghetto seems to have been originally a place in Venice, a quarter of the city in which the first Jewish settlement was located, after it became in course of time an institution recognized in custom and culture, a portion of the city where other Europeans made sure that they were isolated. So if we're critically thinking about, and we go back to what Mr. Shields has said about color being inherently meaningless, then I say to Mr. Edward Shields and those who he has mentored, he's absolutely incorrect. And Dr. John Hope Franklin says it again. If the house is to be set in order, one cannot begin with the present. We must begin with the past, critically thinking. So I question Mr. Shields today. And I question the people who he has, over time, raised to think the same way he does. And one of the wisest thoughts can always be that of clarity. And the most honorable Elijah Muhammad said in 1965, our oppressors are determined to keep our eyes in the sky while they control the land under our feet. These particular thoughts challenge the idea of what Mr. Shields has said. And Dr. Carter G. Woodson, in his very necessary work, 1933, The Miseducation of the Negro, he says the only question which concerns us here is whether these educated persons are actually equipped to face the ordeal before them or unconsciously contribute to their own undoing by perpetuating the regime of the oppressor. Very brilliant work in 1933. And he goes on to ask these questions. What do we say today when we ask Mr. Shields, the professor, and those of his educational scions, and his science is natural science, is color inherently meanest in American society? Is it more of a situation where one group has privilege, where another group has no privilege? Well, some of these things that we have discussed are surely, for those of you all who have paid attention, have surely sparked some sort of thought, because we have reversed the idea of the paradigm. This has been a sweeping shift just to forward the thought of it being another idea about what we know as historical dictums, what we have taken without question. Well, there's a group of us who will always question them. The academy perhaps won't allow it. Some of the things that we understand perhaps won't allow it. But when we have these small pockets and spaces of intellect, then we understand truly just how important critical thinking is. I question again, without any equivocation, the idea of what Mr. Shields has said about color being inherently meaningless in American society. And I'll say what the most honorable Elijah Muhammad said in 1965, What can the guilty say when their truth of their guilt is made known? We wanted to forward you these things so that you go back and research some of these folks that we have mentioned to you. Some of these things that we have brought as just ideas. This is in no means attempting to do anything other but expose and spark a thought. Ladies and gentlemen, this information may in no means change your life, but because truth and you are so very important to me, I just thought you ought to know. I remain, with esteem and respect, a distinguished man of color, Frederick Douglass Dixon. Thank you.